The march towards liberty starts now. This is Freedom Watch.
Big government is getting even bigger. GOP presidential candidates Ron Paul and Gary Johnson explain why super committee Republicans must fight to keep out tax hikes and keep in spending cuts. And with more than half the states challenging Obamacare, Senator John Barrasso explains why Obamacare might already be dead on arrival in the Supreme Court. Plus, Walter Williams and Wayne Rogers ask the Occupy Wall Street protesters why they don't object to celebrities who make twice as much as corporate CEOs do. Perhaps the demonstrators are unaware of these principles. That government is best which governs least. The people are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. Paul, Johnson, Barrasso, Williams, Rogers, Freedom Watch. The revolution continues now.
Tonight on the docket, it's the one-year anniversary that your Night Watchman of Freedom began airing nightly. Oh, and a lot has changed since then. After Republicans gained the House on a wave of anti-government fury backed by Freedom Watch, the tide may be turning once again, and that has us very alarmed and looking forward to another year of serving as your Night Watchman. If you rewind to this time last year, Republicans had just taken over the House, benefiting from the nationwide Tea Party mandate. Many of those Republicans had just sworn their allegiance to the Pledge to America, which promised to extend the Bush-era tax cuts, to enact tax deductions for small businesses, and to require all proposed legislation to state where it gets its constitutional authority from. Now, fast forward to today. And Republicans are wavering from that promise as they attack the most productive in our society and make concessions to the Democrats on taxes. Who could have imagined that this major retreat would lie in the Republicans' future? A future that seemed to have limited government pursuits on its horizons. Consider for a moment Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn's attack on a few celebrities and billionaires for taking tax breaks based on farm subsidies created and supported by Republican and Democratic lawmakers. Senator Coburn calls this welfare for the well-off. We call this obvious Republican populism. Farm subsidies are wrong, but the government cannot attack people for exploiting what laws the government has written. As we'll learn later in the show from Congressman Ron Paul, this is yet another sign that Republicans are folding on taxes and spending, just like they did with the debt ceiling last summer when they let the president borrow another $2.4 trillion. The only fiscal conservatives, it seems, with backbone are making their stands on the state level, where 26 state attorneys general are opposing in court the president's costly and unconstitutional health care overhaul and its individual mandate. So why the disconnect between the states and the feds? Stated differently, the states are screaming in favor of limited government. So why is the Congress, even many Republicans, still embracing big government? Here with insights is Republican Senator and orthopedic surgeon, Dr. John Barrasso. Senator, doctor, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Judge, thanks so much for having me, and happy anniversary on the first anniversary of Freedom Watch.
Oh, you're very kind, Senator. Thank you. We enjoy our work here and look forward to continuing to have good folks like you on the show. You recently argued, I think very persuasively, that Obamacare will actually reduce the coverage that Medicare affords to seniors. Yet, if Obamacare is struck down by the courts, the Democrats will say the same thing about conservative Republicans, that they're the ones that cause the courts to interfere with free health care coming from the feds. How do you answer that?
Well, a couple of things. One is I believe that this health care law is unconstitutional. The state of Wyoming, my home state, has entered into this suit. I don't believe the government has a right in a free society to come into your home and mandate that you buy a product. And, you know, just this past week, Senator Tom Coburn and I came out with a report on Medicare. This health care law, Judge, took $500 billion away from our seniors on Medicare, not to help save or strengthen Medicare, but to start a whole new government program for other people. Plus, about a quarter of the people on Medicare enjoy something called Medicare Advantage. There are advantages to it, and that's why so many people sign up for it. But this administration is attacking it as well.
I understand your argument. Here's where you and I may disagree. We both agree that Obamacare is profoundly unconstitutional. You can't make people wear hats in the sun. You can't make them eat broccoli. You can't make them buy a product whether it's good for them or not. But if Obamacare is unconstitutional, isn't Medicare unconstitutional? I mean, where in the Constitution is the Congress authorized to take money from you or me and force us to participate in a program from which we are never likely to benefit, or out of which we will get no benefits because we'll probably have private health insurance?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch the Supreme Court. I think it's going to be the Supreme Court hearings of the century. They're setting aside 5.5 hours to debate not just the individual mandate component of it, but also coercion of the states by Medicaid, and also whether this is something that they shouldn't even be dealing with until 2014. So there are a number of things, and it'll be interesting to see how they rule, and if they do strike down the individual mandate, which I believe is unconstitutional, does in fact the entire law fall, or are there parts of it that continue? So, I mean, there's Medicare components of this, there's Medicaid components of this, individual insurance. This is going to be really a century of important.
But really you're a small government Republican from a rugged individualistic state, Senator Barrasso, the state of Wyoming. Isn't this whole business of the federal government making you contribute to some program and then theoretically receiving the money at the end of your life cycle nowhere authorized in the Constitution?
Well, I can't find it in the Constitution, but you're right. Wyoming is a state of rugged individualists. We have a very strong economy right now for all the right reasons. We balance our budget every year. We have few regulations, and we are a right-to-work state. Those are the models that the president ought to be following if he wants to deal with his 14 million unemployed Americans, 9% unemployment. Instead, he has spent so much time on this health care law, which is something he wanted, instead of focusing on the economy, which is what the American people wanted. And I'll tell you, Judge, you saw it last week in Ohio when people went to the polls and by 2-1 voted against the individual mandate, against what the president says is important for them.
I hope the president listens to you, Senator Barrasso, but I won't hold my breath. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
They make millions and billions of dollars, and they're the very definition of the 1%. No, we're not talking about Wall Street stock traders or even the CEOs down there. I'm talking about celebrities. They make as much as, if not more than, the financial titans the Occupy Wall Street protesters are railing against. Yet the progressive protesters haven't dared to target Hollywood or sports. Here with insights on this nonsensical behavior is economist and George Mason University economics professor and good friend of the show, Walter Williams. Professor Williams, always a pleasure. Welcome here.
Good evening, Judge.
So tell us, who makes more money typically, CEOs or the top-of-the-line athletes and superstars in Hollywood, and yet who's being targeted by this ragtag group downtown?
Well, if you look at the Forbes celebrity list, it turns out that the top 10 celebrities, they earn an average of $100 million a year. The top 10 CEOs earn an average of $43 million a year. And so you might ask, well, how come the people who are stirring up the politics of envy and hatred towards the CEOs for all the money that they're making, and not turning against Oprah and other people who are making millions of dollars a year more than the CEOs? Well, I'll give you the reason.
Let's hear it.
That is, tyrants, they want to create envy and hatred towards the people whose operations they want to take over. That is, they want to take over the businesses in the United States, but they can't take over the Oprah show. They can't take over LeBron James and the basketball. So they can make the celebrities can make as much money as they want, but the people who they want direct hatred and envy towards, they're the people whose lives they want to take over,
Okay.
namely the companies of our country.
You wrote an interesting piece recently in which you addressed the issue of who really pays taxes. When this crowd downtown and their supporters in the Democratic Party and in the White House want to raise corporate taxes, do they have any idea who actually pays corporate taxes? Can you explain that for us, Professor Williams?
Well, I think that we have to recognize, and I think you recognize very well, that corporations are legal fictions, and as such, they don't pay taxes. Just as if you put a tax on a car, Virginia has a car tax, but do you think cars pay taxes? There's property taxes. Property doesn't pay taxes. Only people pay taxes. So if you impose a tax on a corporation, the corporation, if it's going to stay in business, it's going to do one of three things or some combination of them. They're going to raise the price of the product, so people pay the tax. They're going to lower dividends, again, people pay the tax. And they're going to lay off workers, again, people pay the tax. So corporations are not they don't pay taxes.
Right.
They collect taxes and send them to the government. So we should call corporations tax collectors.
You got it, and you explained it so nicely, and we're deeply grateful for that. Walter Williams, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
And thank you, and happy anniversary.
Thank you, Professor. It's not just the feds. Cash-strapped localities continue to struggle in this economic downturn. Take, for example, Jefferson County, Alabama, which just filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the nation's history. This as cities nationwide default on bond payments at an almost epidemic rate. The legal and financial fallout from this unsteady trend in muni bonds has peaked. My next guest interest after reading about big spending, and guess where he read it? In a new book called It's Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong. Here to discuss is my good friend Wayne Rogers, CEO of Wayne Rogers and Company, and also known to you for earlier exploits when he was younger in front of the camera. Wayne, it's a pleasure. Welcome here.
Thank you, Judge.
Why should we in New York, you in Salt Lake City, folks in Florida or Washington State be worried about the collapse of this county in central Alabama?
Well, as you know, in California, prior to this, there was a bankruptcy in Vallejo, California, where they defaulted because 80% of the money of the budget of Vallejo, California was going to pay pension plans, public pension plans for firemen and policemen.
Right.
If that is perpetuated, and it's big, as you well know, here in New York City.
Right.
It's big in every city. Sooner or later, just like Greece, you can't keep that up.
Okay, so if you extrapolate out the Jefferson County's Californias and the Vallejo County Californias, Jefferson County, Alabama, are we in danger of becoming like Greece? Stated differently, is there a lesson for us to learn from what happened in Greece and is happening in Italy, or is it too late for us to learn it, Wayne?
You know, but you raise an interesting question, because the too late part comes to the size of the debt.
Exactly.
And can we as taxpayers afford that size of debt without, I've told my kids and my grandkids, you got to get used to a different standard of living, because it's not going to be like this, because the U.S. debt, as we know, is totally out of control. Can we ultimately pay it off? We have to produce a lot of goods and services. There's got to be a lot of GDP to ultimately pay that debt. I don't know. I worry about it.
Some free market folks have said that the federal government will never, ever, ever be able to pay off its debt. It's scheduled to hit $15 trillion today, which, of course, is a number that's incomprehensible to most people. Well, what do you say about the concept of federal bankruptcy? Put aside the legal implications of the government not paying its debt and the constitutional implications of that. What would the economic implications be of Tim Geithner saying, wiping the slate clean?
Well, Tim Geithner is not capable of saying anything, so I don't.
We all agree on that.
Yeah, so I don't know what he could say about it. I honestly don't know. I don't think anybody has ever faced that. You're a constitutional lawyer. I don't know what the implications.
Well, the government has defaulted before in other ways. I would argue the government defaults every day when it pays back a loan using cash that is worth less than it was when they borrowed it, and they devalued it.
That's true. Well, that's erosive default. Yes,
right.
It's constantly constantly eroding. There's no doubt about that. I don't know, but ultimately, when you say if you had a judicial default, I don't know what that means.
There'd be massive constitutional implications to it, and the government would end up selling a lot of its real estate.
Well, not only that, I think we'd have riots in the street, just like Greece has. I assume at some point they'd call out the National Guard, and we'd have a military dictatorship. I think that's where it's headed.
Are you worried about the Occupy Wall Street, or you think they're just a bunch of crazy kids with nothing better to do?
Well, they're ill-informed. That's the terrible part. None of those people have read. They would know that this is not Wall Street, that this is the Congress. They should be down in front of the Washington Mall. That's where they should be. And it's the Congress who caused this, not Wall Street. Wall Street took advantage of something. The Congress, by abolishing the Glass-Steagall bill, let investment banks and commercial banks get back together, and they took advantage of it, and they sold a lot of Chinese paper, if you will, to everybody, and they bought it, and bingo. But that was bound to happen. I mean, it was. When I testified before the Congress in 1991, I predicted that, not because I'm smart, but because, just as you said,
you read the numbers.
Yes.
Wayne Rogers, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
My good friend. The revolution continues right here in just a moment.
Big bonuses and bigger housing loan limits. Governor Gary Johnson asks why lawmakers have let Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac run crazy. Then we've got the details on why the feds let Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, but not other corporations, keep their disclosures under wraps. But first, Congressman Ron Paul sounds the alarm on Republicans bashing the most productive in our society as the GOP throws in the towel on tax hikes to solve this nation's ballooning debt problem. Those stories and more, only on Freedom Watch. Stay with us.
It's a new low. Republicans have now joined Democrats in beating up on the most productive people in our society. Yes, you heard me correctly. Republicans are attacking millionaires, John Bon Jovi, Bruce Springsteen, Quincy Jones, Ted Turner, not for their political views, but for the way they get tax breaks. This is Supercommittee Republicans waver on their fiscal conservative stance in favor of a tax hike. Here with insights is a man who will never compromise his fiscal conservatism, a quality that has him surging in polls. In a recent poll, Texas Republican Congressman Ron Paul is tied for first place with Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, and Herman Cain. Will his hordes of devotees in the great state of Iowa propel him to victory in those caucuses in less than 2 months? Congressman Paul, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge.
Are you surprised that Republican senators are saying what they're saying? I don't expect you to jump on a particular senator, but Senator Coburn says we got to stop these rich people from taking advantage of loopholes that we have written. And Senator Pat Toomey, who once had a reputation for being as faithful to the free market as you have when he was the president of the Club for Growth, now saying, well, on the super committee, we might accept $1.50 in cuts for every dollar in tax hikes. Tax hikes? Where does he come off with that?
It's never worked before. It won't work again. And the real confusion comes from there are some rich people who get benefits from government, you know, and work with the Federal Reserve, and they get their bailouts. That's one thing. But if you're productive, taxing people who are productive is the worst thing that we could do. One of the reasons that they get confused on this is they don't understand that all capital comes from savings, work, effort, and production, and then savings. We've been taught for the past 40 years that capital comes out of a printing press and out of a computer, so that's where the confusion comes from. But we should not tax success. There's no way that's going to be helpful.
What do the Republicans hope to gain from this? I mean, for example, do your sources tell you that the super committee, which you and I believe is unconstitutional and shouldn't be there in the first place, but that's what we're stuck with for now, is hopelessly deadlocked? And so do they want to win the PR value since they're not going to get legislation out of this committee that Republicans can endorse?
It's all a PR battle, and it's all a struggle for power and maintaining power and not cleaning up the mess. And the one problem that the conservatives have is they won't accept the fact that maybe we spend too much money overseas. Maybe our foreign policy needs adjusted. They will not contemplate that in any way. So they want to tinker around the edges and come up with tax gimmicks and not admit the truth. And on the other side, including many Republicans, they don't want to touch any bailouts either, you know, the entitlement system. And that's where our problem is. The American people are part of the problem, is they've been taught to be dependent on government programs. So we as a country have to decide whether we want a government that's going to police the world and take care of us from cradle to grave. And if we want it to happen, then we're going to have the total bankruptcy of this country, and we'll end up with runaway inflation. That's how the debt will be liquidated. And we're on the verge of moving into that area. And it can go quickly. This is what people don't realize. Sometimes you drift along, but when it comes rather quickly.
If you were the president, what would you be pushing on the well, we wouldn't have a super committee if you were president, but if you were the president, what would you be urging the Congress to do right now in this present unfortunate, unhappy recession in which we find ourselves?
Quit lying to themselves and look at my proposal. I said the first year, if the government, if our country gets serious, you could cut $1 trillion out of it and it would help us. And I used the example after World War II that we cut spending by 60% and we cut taxes by 30% and 10 million people came home. And guess what? The Depression finally ended. So I would say we should look at that example and not this whole idea that the Keynesian argument is that we're in a recession because there's not enough spending. So government is supposed to spend, and people who have no credit left, they're supposed to go out and get another credit card and they'll spend, and that's how you end the recession. That's a completely false idea.
The first significant event in the Republican primary / caucus season is the Iowa caucuses. And you are now tied in the latest Bloomberg poll with Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, and Herman Cain. Is the media going to start mentioning the fact that you're up there in first place with them in this very significant poll, Congressman Paul?
Well, probably not. So I'm not expecting too much from them. But I tell you what, the more they ignore me, the more attention we get because they see it's so unfair. So if this continues, they won't be able to stop us. And the one thing I'm pleased with the poll, although we're really tied with 3 other people, is the fact that when we get supporters, when supporters come into our camp, they usually never leave. But if you look at the past 6 months, they come and go with the other candidates. So there's reason for us to be very optimistic.
Got it. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Judge.
Where did $100 million of your tax dollars go? In Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's executives' wallets. That's where. So why is it they deserve such a hefty payday on your dime? Former New Mexico governor and Republican candidate for president Gary Johnson answers that. He's here and he's next. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac executives have gotten up to, you ready for this, $100 million in pay packages on your dime, America. Usually you get that kind of bonus when you've been very productive. But what have these executives done except lose millions and billions of your money, all for the sake of a government-backed housing market? Will the government ever get out of a sector in which it does not belong? Here to discuss is former New Mexico governor and Republican presidential hopeful Gary Johnson. Governor Johnson, it's a pleasure. Welcome here. What the heck are we doing?
Incredibly outrageous. I mean, this is outrageous. This is Occupy Wall Street.
What are we doing with Fannie and Freddie in the first place? Why should the government even be in the business of buying bad mortgages from banks?
Take the write down. Get out of the business. Get out of the business. And of course, we're in the business and we're issuing bonuses on top of it. This is the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is the notion that everybody in the country is outraged over the fact that this country doles it out unfairly. I think government's at the root of that. Politicians are at the root of this when it comes to payola. Pay me and I'll grant you your special loophole.
Why can't the anger that you just so articulately and passionately expressed, and the anger that those folks down at Occupy Wall Street have been arguing for, why can't that be channeled into some electoral process? If there are that many people mad at the government, if there are that many people who think crony capitalism has to stop, why hasn't it stopped?
I think we're at that point right now. I think that this is what the country is clamoring for, is to see this stop, to see this notion of what can government do? Government can create a level playing field, but it is anything but level. I always cringe when government gets involved in some business and makes money. It makes me cringe because then they just think it's easy and, gosh, we'll get involved in other things too.
The 3 or 4 minutes that you and I have been chatting is more time than you have gotten in any of the last 3 or 4 or 5 nationally televised Republican gubernatorial debates. You were in the Fox debate. You haven't been in a debate since then. Why did they exclude you?
Judge, here's the rub. The debates have a criteria that you have to be at a certain percentage of X polls.
What is the percentage?
I am not 1%, 2%, whatever.
Okay,
I am not in the polls. During the last CNBC poll, the criteria was that you had to be at 3% in any national poll. I was 3% in a Gallup poll in last May, and they wouldn't return my phone calls.
You're telling me that the polls on which the networks rely in order to determine who has enough traction to be in their debates do not have a place to check Gary Johnson?
That's correct. The poll that you just showed on your show in Iowa did not have my name on that poll.
And why is that?
Why is that? This has to be a boardroom decision, and why?
All right.
Why?
All right. Let me ask you the same question I just asked Ron Paul. Put aside Fannie and Freddie, unless you choose to mention it. If you were president of the United States today, in this unfortunate and unhappy economic environment, what would you be urging upon the Congress?
I'm promising to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. Now, that isn't to say we balance the budget, but I'm promising to submit a balanced budget.
Where would you cut?
43%. Let's start with Medicaid, Medicare, and military spending. But down the list, I'm going to detail that document. That's going to be a document that's going to be hotly debated and contested.
Would your cuts save anybody? Or are you talking about 40% across the board? Foreign aid, Pentagon, Social Security, Medicare entitlements, interest payments, discretionary payments, Justice Department?
About the only thing I can think of is veterans' benefits. That's about the only thing that gets excluded.
Everything else would be cut by a President Johnson.
I think there's a 43% largesse built into everything. And when you talk about reducing the military spending by 43%, you're talking about going back to when Bush took office.
Wow.
Is that so outrageous?
Does reducing military spending make us less strong militarily?
That's the crux of all this. We can provide a strong national defense for this country and still cut the military by 43%. The biggest threat to our country's security is the fact that we're bankrupt, the fact that we are borrowing and, for the most part, printing 43 cents out of every dollar that we're spending.
I wish they had you on those polls and in those debates. Governor Johnson, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Of course. The fur is really flying. Find out which local government is trying to ban people from wearing fur. Can they get away with it? It's a Freedom File you won't want to miss. Look at that. That's next. Now a few items from our Freedom Files. Can the government regulate what you wear? Well, in West Hollywood, California, it's trying to do just that. Recently, the city council there approved a ban on fur, but the ban hasn't gone into effect yet. First, an economic impact study has to be conducted. This is California, of course. Then the council will assess the study before voting on the ban. The current legislation's draft is so broad it would have jurisdiction over calfskin, shearling, sheepskin, shoes, boots, belts, hats, gloves, and even scarves. I don't know if they wear hats or scarves in Southern California. But how can any government think it can regulate the belts around people's waists and the shoes on their feet, all in the name of animal welfare? And you know I'm an animal lover. But apparently the city has abandoned alternatives to address this concern and is going full speed ahead on banning fur. Freedom Watch will keep you updated on this one. It's the nightmare before Christmas and Thanksgiving. The TSA has reissued a bulletin warning bus passengers of a holiday terrorist threat. This threat doesn't come in response to any new terrorist threat. The warning is not new, but the TSA says it's being reissued because of a general threat in America against mass transit. But since it's not a new threat, is it possible that Cousin Janet and her goons are trying to scare you enough into letting you permit them to violate your Fourth Amendment rights during the holidays when people are traveling en masse as they visit family and friends? And even if there were a new terrorist threat that inspired the reissuing of this bulletin from the TSA, no security threat is so epic that you should compromise your right to privacy and protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. Tell the feds to get a search warrant. And tonight, a new low in the police response to the Occupy Wall Street protests. First, New York City police raided Zuccotti Park in riot gear at 1:30 in the morning, while most of the occupiers slept to remove them for safety reasons. Then they continued to raid and remove these people, even after a New York State Supreme Court justice enjoined the police at 6:30 in the morning from doing so. And if that weren't enough, police took over 5,000 books from the Occupy Wall Street library, sort of a spontaneous public collection of the literature these folks read, and threw them into city-owned garbage trucks. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's office admits the protesters' possessions were placed in sanitation vehicles, but insists they will be available for pickup later. So the protesters should not complain. They can just dig their books and their belongings out of the garbage. There are many reasons to criticize the Occupy Wall Street movement, but this kind of police response is inexcusable. Late today, another New York State Supreme Court justice permitted the demonstrators to return to the park, but prohibited them from remaining there overnight. Recent gaffes have led to a Republican primary that's unpredictable and without a clear front runner at any given time. Businessman Herman Cain struggled to articulate his stance on President Obama's war in Libya, one that didn't get congressional approval. And of course, recent polling shows Governor Mitt Romney's approval rating is waning, while Congressman Ron Paul's popularity in Iowa is surging. This while former House Speaker Newt Gingrich is catching flack for his former association with the government's giant mortgage monsters, Fannie and Freddie, a relationship that now seems to have been perhaps more involved than the former speaker at first admitted. Here to discuss is Fox News senior political analyst, my colleague and friend, Brit Hume. Brit, it's a pleasure. Welcome here.
Thanks, Judge.
Are we going to go through a new person at the head of the Republican ranks almost every week? I mean, at one point it was Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, Herman Cain, Rick Perry, and now the former speaker.
Well, that's what's happened. And mostly it's been, I mean, Romney's standing has been essentially unchanged within a few points. But a number of different people have surged to be the alternative to him, only almost immediately to fade. That's what happened with Michelle Bachmann. That's what happened to Rick Perry, who took her place. And then his place, when he faltered, was taken by Herman Cain, who has now stumbled, as we've seen. So now Newt Gingrich seems to be having his moment, with Ron Paul picking up a little of that support as well. Right. I'm not sure how well Newt Gingrich will do in the glare of scrutiny that is going to come his way by virtue of his standing in the race, but we'll see.
Without getting too much in the weeds, Governor Romney was blasted today by Republican and conservative leaders in Iowa for, quote, skipping Iowa. Is his sort of on-again, off-again dance in Iowa, is this potentially fatal to his candidacy, or is this a strategic decision? Do they know what they're doing?
You can lose Iowa and win. If you lose Iowa and New Hampshire, it's hard to win. And one of the things that can happen to you is if you win Iowa, you go into New Hampshire as the clear front runner. And New Hampshire has been tough on clear front runners, as Barack Obama found most recently to his pain. And, you know, Mike Huckabee, remember, he came roaring out of Iowa and ended up going nowhere. So Iowa is one of those places that's important to give you some altitude, but New Hampshire is a place that's waiting with the anti-aircraft battery, so you have to be careful about Iowa. And Mitt Romney didn't do well 4 years ago despite an enormous effort there, so he's been very reluctant, I think, to go all in Iowa this time, although some think he might be able to win there.
Got it. Britt, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
Government winners and losers. The feds let Warren Buffett, of all people, keep one key disclosure a secret. But they levied a heavy fine on American Eagle Airlines for tarmac delays. Why does the government selectively enforce its own laws? My freedom fighters weigh in on this predictable favoritism, and they're here next. Tonight we're learning that there's another Buffett rule legendary investor Warren Buffett can lend his name to. Only this time the Obama administration may not want to roll out the red carpet for it. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been shielding Warren Buffett from public scrutiny over the past 8 months as his company, Berkshire Hathaway, soaked up an over 5% stake in IBM, news that rocked the technology sector in yesterday's trading session. Here to discuss now are my freedom fighters, Fox Business senior correspondent and my colleague Dunstan Pryl, radio host Nancy Skinner, and James Otteson, Yeshiva University professor of economics. Nancy, I'm dying to know how you think about this. So do you first. Is this guy entitled to an exemption from the laws that are supposed to be enforced on every publicly traded corporation because he's so rich, because his decisions are so smart, and he's such a good friend of the president?
No, Judge, and I am so with you on this one. He should not, okay? These F3 exemptions are junk, and the invisible hand that Adam Smith envisioned wasn't letting these big guys make secret plays behind the scenes.
Right.
But Goldman Sachs did the same thing. They're pushing instruments that they're shorting. So all of that has to be on the record so people can make informed decisions. That's capitalism.
Got it. Does the SEC, Professor, should the SEC have this kind of discretion to exempt somebody as well known as he is from an accumulation as massive as 5% of IBM?
No, of course not. But on the other hand, I don't think we can blame Buffett for this, Judge.
Right.
He's just acting rationally. When you have a set of rules, remember in the Rule 13F, there is an explicit exception allowed to the SEC. They have the discretion to withhold exposure, withhold revealing the information if they want to. If you're going to have this exception, you're going to have people like Buffett who are making use of it.
Well,
why not?
Dunstan, what does Wall Street think of this when the rules are enforced against everybody but one, and he happens to be the king of the hill?
Judge, I'm going to go big picture on you. I spent today, there was a big story down at Occupy Wall Street tonight.
Right.
Can they go? Can they stay?
Right.
I don't think I'd be able to explain the minutia of this loophole to the folks down there, but they'll get the big picture. The rules are different for rich people, you know, and it's easy for Warren Buffett to defend something like this because we like Warren Buffett and he's our grandfather and all the rest. But the rules are different for him than they are for me. Why isn't there a rule in place for Dunstan to make more money? Because I don't have the money to buy the politicians in Wall Street down in...
Do you know if this you can accept whoever you want from the enforcement of your regulations in the SEC Act has ever been challenged? Because this is not equal treatment of people similarly situated.
No, not only hasn't it been challenged, but there was an audit done in 2010. It turns out that over 90% of the exceptions they granted were done without any oversight. So it's essentially one regulator. So all Warren Buffett has to do, or it's not just Warren Buffett, there are other very wealthy investors as well. All they have to do is convince just one regulator. Would you keep this under the hat, under the rug for me for a little bit? That's all they have to do.
Got it. Switching gears. It's the kind of airport nightmare. No, hang on, Nancy. I'll go to you first on this one. It's the kind of airport nightmare no traveler wants to deal with. A few months ago, a regional affiliate of American Airlines kept over 600 passengers from 15 different flights on the tarmac for over 3 hours. The Department of Transportation swooped in and slapped American Airlines with a $900,000 fine. That's the largest ever paid in a consumer case not involving civil rights violations. However, it is arguable that it is the government which regulates the airport, the government which caused the delays, and the government which collects the fines, not the passengers, Nancy Skinner. What the heck is fair about this? You sit on a runway for 6 hours and the government makes the money and not you?
Judge, as a good libertarian, you should be appalled that a corporate entity can keep you beyond your will for 10 hours without food, water, or toilets. And if you want to go back to that gate and get a refund and catch another flight, you can't. If the government did the same thing to you, Judge, you would be apoplectic. So what they're trying to do is say, hey, you can't do that. It's fraud and it's personal freedom.
Okay, I agree with everything you said, but shouldn't the passengers get the money? Let's look at it this way. The federal government regulates the airports. The federal government controls the airways. The federal government arguably caused these delays, and the federal government is making money from the fines. Shouldn't the people who suffered in the environments Nancy just described, no food, no water, no fresh air, no toilets, shouldn't they get the fines?
Absolutely, but you have to remember that what's going on in this case is that the airlines have two masters, not one. The one master is the consumer, the person who's flying on the plane, but they also have to pay attention to the FAA. The CEO of the American Eagles Airlines issued a statement in which he said, we do everything we can to comply with FAA regulations. That's the problem. They're not worried about the consumer. They're worried about the FAA regulations.
Dunstan, would you stir this pot, please?
Yes, I am. And, Judge, I'm going to side with the government on this one. Heaven help me. And I'm going to do it for one reason.
Skinner is jumping for joy.
The reason I'm going to do that, it's working. According to the statistics, a year ahead, before these penalties were implemented, 690 of these instances, something like that, since the rules were implemented and the fines put in place, down to 20, 30, something like that. So if it's working and the government put it in place, I'm on board with it.
Nancy, doesn't your big heart for the little guy want some of that money to go to the people who suffered in that smelly environment of stench rather than to Tim Geithner's coffers in Washington, D.C. for him to waste? Go ahead.
You know what? You need a big stick to get them to do that, and that's why they went down. They bump you voluntarily, but you know what? They know it's not all the FAA's fault. They know the weather situation. They know that they've overbooked flights. They know you're going to be sitting on that tarmac for 5 hours, so they should be penalized for that.
I really think that the passengers should get some of the money, and that would be an inducement. We just have a few seconds, Professor.
You have to look at what's seen and what's unseen. What's seen is that the tarmac times have gone down. That's true. But what's unseen is all the additional costs that have been layered on in inflexible routes, times that passengers are not able to fly to certain routes. All of that is the unseen cost that's not in the regular.
Nancy Skinner, James Otteson, Dunstan Prial, it's a pleasure, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
I'll tell you more tales from the secret super committee's crypt. That's coming up next. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Can the government defy the Constitution and write laws in secret? Tonight, more super nonsense from the secret super committee. You know the story by now. Congress cannot get its act together again. It is facing a government shutdown by this Saturday again. It has retreated to secrecy again. It seems redundant and ridiculous to say, here we go again, yet that's what's happening. Congress, which is charged and authorized by the Constitution to write the federal laws and to decide how to spend the people's money and to keep public records of all that it does, has simply declined to do so. In establishing this super committee, which consists of 6 representatives and 6 senators, Congress is violating the Constitution by keeping the super committee's work and deliberations away from you. Every hour here at Fox, our wonderful and intrepid Capitol Hill producers inform us of who is meeting with whom to discuss what on Capitol Hill. Not from among members of the House or the Senate, but from among the members of the super committee. Try to find the super committee in the Constitution, and you will not succeed. This is what has become of the world's greatest deliberative body. It is hiding from you. Its members are supposed to work for you. The government is the servant of the people. As revolutionary as that sounds, it is the principle underlying both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Now, some of you have sent us very funny emails asking why at the outset of each of these closing arguments here on Freedom Watch, we always ask if the government works for us or if we work for the government. Well, now you have the answer. The government calls the shots. Both political parties stand for big government. Few in government really want to be subservient to the people or to be transparent to them. Government treats us as if we have an unending pile of cash from which it can extract what it wishes, and it treats us as if we do work for it. America, it is the height of arrogance and of disrespect for you, for the Constitution, and for basic principles of personal liberty in a free society, for the government to work in the dark. You know, the founders feared secret government because they had suffered so heavily under the Privy Council. The Privy Council was not the King of England, and it was not the Parliament. It consisted of a dozen of the King's most trusted advisors, some of whom were members of Parliament, who really ran the British government when we were colonies. And the Privy Council met in secret. Well, to assure that the new government here would not do to Americans what the British government had done to the colonists, the founders wrote into the Constitution the obligation of Congress to meet in public, to keep a public journal of all that it does, and to be the only entity in the government that can write laws, regulate behavior, or tax events. America, your representatives in the House and in the Senate have made a mockery of our Constitution. The secret super committee, around which has swirled all sorts of rumors about raising taxes and increasing regulations, has effectively become the Congress. Once it reports whatever it has agreed to, Congress cannot debate that report. Congress cannot publicly discuss that report. Congress cannot vote to amend that report. Congress can only vote that report up or down. This modern-day Privy Council has robbed you of your representation in the government and the transparency guaranteed by the Constitution. What can we do about this? We can continue to challenge the government as we do every night here on Freedom Watch. And candidly, you can read my new book, It is Dangerous to be Right When the Government is Wrong, because it lays out the case for personal freedom. And it tells you clearly what the government can and must do and what the government cannot lawfully do. Today's a special day at Freedom Watch. We began as a daily show 1 year ago today. Candidly, we would be nothing without you. And just as candidly, your night watchman would be nothing without the hard work, dedication to our values, and highest degree of professionalism that the Freedom Watch team brings to these shows every day. They are the best production team with which I have had the pleasure of working in all my years on television. If you love this show as I do, you love them as I do. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.